911, state your emergency.
Emergency! The whale grabbed her. She's been dragged under. It's not letting go. We need help now. It was supposed to be a flawless performance, a breathtaking display of trust between human and animal. But something went terribly wrong. What began as a routine show ended in unimaginable tragedy. This is the story of Nora Levy, a respected Orca trainer whose final moments left a permanent scar on the world of marine entertainment. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story so we can keep bringing you powerful documentaries like this one. Let's dive in. From the time she was a child, Nora Levy found solace in the language of the ocean. While other kids watched cartoons, Nora memorized whale songs. At age 10, she could mimic the clicks and whistles of whale with eerie precision. By 16, she was volunteering at her city's marine center, scrubbing tanks, observing feeding behaviors, and taking notes no one asked her to take. From the time she was a child, Nora Levy found solace in the language of the ocean, one spoken not in words, but in glances, currents, and breath. While other kids watched cartoons, Nora memorized whale songs. At age 10, she could mimic the clicks and whistles of whale with eerie precision. By 16, she was volunteering at her city's marine center, scrubbing tanks, observing feeding behaviors, and taking notes no one asked her to take. Trainers described her as the one who never rushed, never raised her voice, and yet always had the animal's attention. They said she listened first, and that's why they listened back. They called him Baylor, but that was never his name. Captured off the eastern coast of Kamchatka, Baylor was barely a calf when the steel net closed behind him. His pod had tried to flee. His mother had refused to leave. She was harpooned in front of him, struck once, then again, until she stilled. Rescuers described the scene as clean, but trauma doesn't leave blood. It leaves memory. He was shipped thousands of miles, tagged, weighed, and entered into a breeding program before he'd learned how to navigate his own grief. For years, Baylor lived in tanks with older dominant males, some aggressive, others indifferent. He bore the scars, deep rake marks down his flanks, torn dorsal tissue, a left eye that never opened fully again. By the time Aurora Marine Sanctuary acquired him, Baylor had learned to perform. But beneath the jumps and the tail slaps was a mind fraying at the edges. He'd float motionless for hours, refuse food, jaw pop at handlers with no provocation. Behaviorists flagged him as high risk. Internal logs note elevated agitation during social pairings, withdrawal during training sessions, and non-compliance with vocal cues. One entry, 6 months before the incident, simply read, "Baylor doesn't look at us anymore, but he filled the seats, and he hadn't hurt anyone. Yet." So the shows continued, and Nora, perhaps the only person he truly responded to, was tasked with maintaining what others only managed: his trust. But trust, once broken in the wild, doesn't always rebuild in captivity. It waits, and when it shatters again, it doesn't warn you. Baylor had been withdrawing for weeks. Trainers noticed he lingered near the gates longer than usual. His movements slowed, his appetite dipped, then fluctuated. He began jaw-popping more frequently. Sharp, audible snaps of the jaw, widely recognized as a warning in Orca behavior. On one occasion, he slapped his pectoral fin against the tank wall hard enough to echo through the glass. These weren't random acts. They were signals. Yet in meeting rooms lined with performance charts and attendance projections, the word agitation was softened into unusual behavior. Concern became caution. Caution became dismissal. One junior handler submitted a behavioral report, flagging Baylor as unstable during group rehearsals. It was returned unread with a note. Too subjective. Reword. Another report, written by Nora herself, documented what she called an emotional disconnection from all cues. Her recommendation: pull Baylor from waterworks sessions. The reply: he's our closing act. March 12th began like any other. But the water knew. The morning sun cast silver streaks across the performance tank. Families filed into the bleachers of Aurora Marine Sanctuary. Children holding souvenir whales. Parents scanning showtimes. Behind the glass, Baylor circled in slow, deliberate patterns, his dorsal fin slicing the surface without sound. Backstage, Nora prepared as she always did. Methodical. Focused. She checked her gear twice, reviewed the routine, nodded silently to the assistant trainers. Baylor had missed 2 cues in rehearsal, but no one called it off. "He'll be fine once the crowd's in," someone said. At 11:53 a.m., the show began. Cheers erupted as Baylor breached, soaking the front rows. He landed heavier than usual. The splash was deeper, but it passed. At 11:56, Nora entered the platform, wetsuit zipped, headset live. She extended her arm, the signal for a side swim. Baylor didn't move. Instead, he hovered, still as stone, then slowly turned, eyes locked on hers, breath loud against the water's surface. Somewhere in the crowd, a child asked, "Is this part of it?" At 11:57 a.m., he surged upward, mouth open, eyes wide. In one fluid, explosive motion, he grabbed Nora by the left shoulder and upper torso, yanking her off the platform and into the pool with such force that her headset tore loose mid-air. Her body hit the water hard, her legs flailing briefly above the surface before vanishing beneath. The audience screamed, but many still believed it was part of the act. That illusion shattered seconds later. Baylor dove deep with her in his jaws. Underwater, the situation turned brutal. Multiple eyewitnesses, including 2 assistant trainers, reported seeing Baylor thrashing violently, not once but repeatedly, dragging Nora in a wide circle around the tank. Her body was limp within 30 seconds. Emergency protocols triggered instantly. Underwater tone disruptors, net barriers, divers on standby. But nothing stopped him. Baylor resurfaced briefly at 11:59, still holding Nora's lifeless body in his mouth, now by the waist. His teeth had punctured deep. Her wetsuit was torn. Her left arm hung at an unnatural angle. He dove again, slower this time, turning with calculated force. Blood began to cloud the tank. At 12:01 p.m., an emergency gate was lowered in an attempt to separate the performance pool. Baylor evaded it. Staff threw fish into the adjacent tank, called out to him with familiar whistles. He didn't respond. His focus never wavered. It was deliberate. At 12:03, the water calmed. Baylor released her. 2 handlers on the rescue platform pulled Nora's body using pole hooks and flotation boards. One of her diving shoes was missing. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly open. Paramedics began CPR, but there was no pulse, no breath. Her death was pronounced at 12:23 p.m. The official cause: drowning with severe internal trauma. Blunt force injuries to the ribs, lungs, and abdomen. Injuries consistent with being shaken, crushed, and held underwater repeatedly, but those were just the facts. What Baylor did in those minutes wasn't random. It wasn't panic, and it wasn't instinct in the traditional sense. It was something darker, something shaped by years of trauma, containment, and pressure. Some witnesses described the moment he let go as eerily gentle, as if he hadn't just ended a life, as if he'd simply finished making a point. 7 minutes. That's all it took to undo 10 years of trust, and to expose a truth the industry could no longer bury. Even the most intelligent predator has a breaking point. And captivity is where that point is often reached, in silence. Behind closed doors, administrators met in hushed voices. At 4:40 p.m., a statement was released. We are deeply saddened to confirm the passing of one of our most experienced and beloved trainers, Nora Levy. Our thoughts are with her family, colleagues, and all those affected by this tragic loss. We are fully cooperating with authorities to investigate the incident. But there were things not said in that statement. Internal logs, previously sealed, were reopened. Behavior reports on Baylor dating back 5 years were pulled. One from 18 months prior warned, increased signs of social withdrawal, reduced responsiveness to positive reinforcement, potential early signs of chronic stress, induced behavioral dysregulation. Another, just 4 weeks before the incident, described Baylor refusing contact sessions for 3 consecutive days. That document was signed by Nora herself. None of it had reached external regulators. Now, federal wildlife officials, representatives from OSHA, and a team of independent marine behaviorists were brought in. Surveillance footage from multiple angles, underwater and topside, was reviewed frame by frame. So were the training logs, the feeding reports, the handler schedules. Everything was combed through. The findings were devastating. The autopsy report, finalized within 48 hours, confirmed extensive trauma. Fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, pulmonary hemorrhaging, bruising around the neck consistent with forceful submersion. The medical examiner noted, even if Ms. Levy had been recovered earlier, her internal injuries were likely non-survivable. But it was the behavioral review of Baylor that delivered the most damning conclusion. This animal demonstrated repeated signs of psychological distress. The cumulative pattern, if addressed sooner, may have prevented escalation. In other words, this was not unforeseeable. Public response was swift. By the 3rd day, hashtags flooded social media. Justice for Nora. Free Baylor. Shut down. Aurora. Former trainers came forward. One anonymously told a major news outlet, "We flagged Baylor so many times. The managers knew. They just didn't want to lose their star act." Outside the sanctuary gates, memorials appeared. Photos of Nora. Flowers. Candles. Hand-painted signs that read, "She trusted. He broke." But others were more pointed. "You knew, and you did nothing." Within a week, protest groups had mobilized. Local news turned national. Editorials questioned not just Baylor's captivity, but the entire Orca performance industry. And through it all, the company held to a single phrase: "We are reviewing our procedures." But procedures had been reviewed before. Warnings had been filed before. And still, one of the most experienced trainers in the country had died in front of hundreds of witnesses, in the same pool she'd once called her second home. Now it was stained, not just with loss, but with a question no PR statement could erase. How many signs have to be ignored before it's no longer a tragedy, but a choice? In the weeks following Nora Levy's death, Aurora Marine Sanctuary entered crisis mode. Meetings turned defensive. Press inquiries were deflected. Lawyers drafted responses before investigators even finished their interviews. Internally, staff were told to remain silent. Externally, the official messaging was calm, controlled, and vague. But outside the park walls, the story was no longer theirs to shape. Former employees began speaking to the press. A retired senior trainer, who had left the park 2 years prior, told a national outlet, "Baylor wasn't just a risk, he was a pressure point, and Nora was the one holding him together. We all knew something would snap, A whistleblower released incident logs never meant for public eyes. Records that showed Baylor had refused waterworks sessions 7 times in the past 2 years. One entry noted a near miss, where he had turned abruptly during a dorsal tow, nearly knocking a trainer off balance. The report had been marked resolved without further action. These revelations ignited public outrage. Petitions surged, gathering over 1.2 million signatures within 10 days. Protesters returned daily to the sanctuary gates. Major newspapers ran editorials titled, "Captivity has a breaking point," and "The performance that should never have happened." Legislators began to take notice. A long-stalled bill, the Marine Mammal Freedom Act, sponsored years ago and left to die in committee, was suddenly revived. Hearings were scheduled. Experts were called to testify, and among them was Dr. Helena Sharif, a marine cognition specialist who had once consulted for Aurora. In her testimony before the subcommittee, she said, "We teach orcas to suppress instinct through reward, but trauma doesn't forget. Baylor didn't attack out of malice. He responded exactly as a wounded, confined, intelligent animal eventually does. He lashed out. The tragedy isn't that it happened. The tragedy is that we kept putting him on stage like it never would. Inside the park, changes were made, but quietly. All water work with orcas was suspended indefinitely. Trainers now remained behind glass barriers during sessions. Baylor was placed on behavioral watch and relocated to a smaller, off-show enclosure. A new position, Director of Orca Enrichment and Welfare, was created, though critics called it a late-stage PR fix. And Nora? She was given a mural near the backstage entrance, a painted portrait, a line from her journal beneath it. "You can't demand trust. You earn it, quietly." But for many, that wasn't enough. Her parents, devastated but composed, appeared publicly only once, during a candlelight vigil outside the sanctuary. They didn't blame Baylor. They didn't even mention his name. Nora's mother simply said, "Our daughter loved these animals, and if she were here, she would ask us not to punish them, but to listen to them, maybe for the first time." In her memory, the Nora Levy Foundation was established, funding research into non-invasive marine mammal care, scholarships for ethical animal behavior studies, and public education on the costs of captivity. Within 6 months, a new phrase entered the industry's vocabulary: Levy protocols. These were guidelines designed not for showmanship, but for safety and sentience. Procedures rooted in emotional observation, not just physical command. Parks in other countries adopted them. A few began phasing out live orca performances altogether. Still, not everyone agreed. Executives at Aurora refused to comment on whether Baylor would ever return to the stage. Some insiders whispered that the decision had already been made. Quiet retirement. No ceremony. No announcement. Just silence. A fitting end, perhaps, for an animal who had been shouting without words for years. Because that's what this story became in the end. Not just the death of a trainer, not even the reckoning of a park. It became a mirror held up to an industry, culture, and a public that had long equated obedience with happiness and applause with consent. Nora's legacy wasn't just in what she taught Baylor. It was in what she made the rest of us finally see. Time moved forward, but the water remembered. The incident faded from headlines, as all things do. The sanctuary reopened under tighter protocols. New safety videos were played before every show. Trainers no longer entered the water. Baylor was no longer part of the rotation, but for those who had been there, for the staff, the visitors, and the family Nora left behind, nothing truly returned to normal. The platform where Nora gave her last command remained empty for months. No one spoke of it directly. Some referred to it only as the deep side. Others simply avoided it altogether. Flowers, once left in grief, decayed and were swept away. But the absence remained, palpable, like a pause that never ends. And Baylor? He spent his days in a side tank, out of public view. Enrichment staff worked with him quietly. He swam less, vocalized more. He no longer responded to performance cues. One trainer described his stare as distant, like he's somewhere else. No one knew if he remembered what he had done, but everyone knew why. Nora's death marked more than the failure of safety protocols. It exposed a truth long buried under choreography and stage lights, that intelligent creatures cannot be packaged into performances without consequence. That trauma does not disappear because an audience is smiling, and that trust, real trust, is not something we can manufacture. In the years that followed, the Nora Levy Foundation became a global advocate for marine mammal reform. Young scientists, inspired by her story, turned to fields focused on conservation, not captivity. 2 marine parks in Europe ended their Orca programs altogether, citing her case as a turning point. Her name began to appear in textbooks, ethics discussions, and even international legislation, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. And yet her story remains difficult to tell because it asks uncomfortable questions. Can true connection exist in a space built on control? Can we claim to love an animal and yet deny it the very freedom that defines its nature? These are not questions for viral outrage or fleeting pity. They are questions for silence, for stillness, for sitting beside a tank, watching a creature built for the open sea move in circles, and asking, honestly, if this is the best we can do. In the end, Nora Levy didn't die in vain. Her legacy isn't just in reforms or foundations or memorial plaques. It lives in every conversation that refuses to ignore discomfort, in every child who learns the ocean is not a stage, in every future trainer who is taught to listen, not command, and in every orca, somewhere, who is finally allowed to simply be what it was always meant to be: wild, unscripted, and free. This was never just about one trainer or one whale. It was about an industry built on illusion, where obedience is mistaken for trust, and captivity is disguised as care. Nora Levy's death was not a random tragedy. It was a predictable outcome of a system that refuses to change until it's too late. If this story unsettles you, let it. If it angers you, let it move you. Speak for those who cannot. Question the shows. Challenge the silence. And above all, remember, love for animals means fighting for their freedom, not applauding their submission.